What's up, everybody? I'm Ray, and this evening we have Stephen Larkin and Daire Bracken, who are just playing, and Andrew Clancy and Colm from Clancy Architects. These guys are pretty young architects. They've been working in Dublin for the last couple of years. They all studied together in Dublin, and after a few years out of college, they established, they were always in conversation, they established a studio together where a lot of young architects are sort of working in one large open space. And I think the important thing for them is always this point of discussion between young architects about how you develop ideas and how you also think about culture and context. And I actually had the privilege of working within that office for a while with Andrew and Colm, and I was always kind of amazed. There's always a lot of contact with culture, with especially Stephen, for example, who's practicing architecture and playing music at the same time. I think Steve, when I was in the office, did a house and an album that year, which was pretty great. And there was always, artists and musicians and sculptors and people always passing through. It was always a very lively place, full of energy and full of these, young, ambitious people. And I think today they're going to talk a bit about how they kind of came up through that kind of way of thinking, and how they started to establish practice and how they started to build. So I'll leave it over to you guys.
Yes. Yeah, so I think Ray has been slightly kind to us. But how do you do that? But effectively, what she says is correct. Like we started out in college with a number of other architects as well, and we believe fundamentally that architecture is a generous activity, that it's not something closed and it's not something competitive. It's something shared and something that you have solidarity with your fellow practitioners and your age group with. And effectively, we all kind of accidentally fell into our own practices through this conversation. We've called the slideshow. This is good. This is entertaining. This is more interesting than the work. But we've called it building practice because we are still in the process of building a practice, both as a business, but more importantly, as a way of working and a way of thinking about how we work. All of us teach, and all of us practice. And we see those two things as synonymous with one another. We see those two things as intrinsically interlinked because both are generous activities. And I think this dance is going to end soon. But I suppose the enjoyable thing, I suppose, about today is that there's two firms here. But in reality, back in Dublin, there's about 5 or 6 of us, and that we work together quite a lot, collaboratively and independently. This is a building that Steve designed. It's mostly composed of thoughts.
But I think the reason we set up the studio is that we graduated in a really privileged position where in Dublin and Ireland there was just so much building that everybody just got sucked or hoovered into offices, and when we left that slightly in disgust, that we didn't want an office. We wanted a studio because a studio was a culture, where things were allowed to sort of ferment and gestate. And I think we tried to gather around us people who were similarly maybe disgruntled or cranky about what had happened in architecture in Ireland at the time.
Yeah. There was lots of building in Ireland and very little architecture. That's kind of difficult because you have to deliberately make a decision which is one that is idealistic and naive, and it's really important, we believe, to remain slightly stupid about the risk of failure, I think. And so having friends around you as stupid as yourself is really important, because you continually...
Even dumber, right?
Yeah. Sometimes you feel more intelligent when there's somebody stupider beside you. So this is the story. We're going to start off with Daire and Steve, maybe, and then we'll talk about our practice, Colm and I, at the end.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's a really interesting thing, and I think the important thing for me anyway is that you do work, and you do work in the kind of understanding that you're not building a career, but you're actually kind of assimilating loads of different ideas, and you're trying to herd all these ideas, and you're not trying to make the piece of work, you're trying to make a piece of work that can overlap lots of different spheres of people who you're building for, different cultural ideas, and culture is very important because it has just much more richness than any one person. So I think that, I'm going to just move on to the next slide. I think this is this project is a project I did with two friends of mine. They run a practice in Dublin called Donaghy and Diamond Architects, and we did this house together for friends of mine in Donegal. And it's very much, as you can see, it's very much in the Donegal landscape, and landscape is a really, really major point of it. The house is on the left there. Errigal, and they have this amazing view up an estuary. And the interesting thing about the people who are this building for is they're musicians. This is kind of a landscape study, just figuring out how this landscape is. And then these people themselves are musicians. This is the famous Johnny Doherty, who's a great fiddle player, who was an itinerant fiddle player who would travel the roads of Donegal, copper smithing, making pots and pans for people. And through the oral culture, he disseminated lots of stories, folklore, and became an absolute extremely knowledgeable and one of the legends of Irish music. The client's uncle is on the right hand side, and that's Joe Burke without his beard. But they're very much involved in that. They're musicians. They play with a very well known band called Alton, and so they wanted to relocate to Donegal and into the culture. So it was really interesting. They also wanted a house for music. This is Ravenna, and the really nice thing about this, you have this two-story middle space, and then you've got a necklace of ancillary spaces which kind of colour sound, and we wanted to take that into the plan. There's also an idea about heart, the vernacular, and that's another overlapping idea. And we tried to generate a plan that kind of worked with all these different elements so that they were very, very comfortable. You can see the kind of general plan shape equal to Ravenna, central room, and then ancillary accommodation around. Can people understand, Stephen? No? Can you understand? Okay. Just making sure. Okay, I'll fix this slow down. So this is the idea of landscape, kind of trying to nestle down and get snug and not be too kind of up in the air. The chimney is about the idea of heart. If you look at old thatched cottages, they're very low, they're very hunkered into the landscape, and you have this kind of picturesque thing of smoke rising from the chimney stacks, the point where everybody meets in this kind of road. It works for them, I think. And you get this kind of language across mountain, you get the landscape always in conversation with the house. And then you get the room for playing in, for having sessions, as we have just done here. And then you get the hearth, and you get ideas of, the red shows how different ancillary spaces can actually resonate in different wavelengths. And then that feeds back into that middle room, and you get light coming down in those areas. And then there's always the moment which is architectural, the moment that gives you a piece of the world and makes a piece of the world your own and your own personal thing. This is a bit of Mairead playing a tune in the house. The house is really good. I went in and played when the house was built, and it sounded really, really nice. And Mairead had a fiddle called a Hardanger fiddle, which is a Norwegian fiddle, and it resonates. The body of the instrument resonates when you play the primary strings, and then the house resonates on top of that. So it's like this overlapping layers of resonance, and it's lovely. It's a really nice environment. So this is Mairead playing in the house, but I don't think you're going to hear it very well.
That's as nice as it goes.
That's it? Okay. If you listen very carefully, you
hear the resonance.
It's okay. That's fine. We just okay. We'll move. This is another project we kind of did. Daire and I did this with a group of UCD students, and that kind of thing of research and ongoing research. Colm and Andrew were involved in this kind of project. That we ran a few research projects in UCD. This is one of them. This is very much taking that idea of resonance in space and trying to make a project out of it. So this is something which is very evident in kind of Western culture, ideas of music and architecture. You probably all know about them. These are just some examples. And what we tried to do was to make 3 rooms basically that you could walk into, and that sound will be played into them, and it becomes like a kind of sound sauna. The box resonates and it becomes quite full and around you. So we tried to figure it out by using just simple tools, a standing wave in a space, something recording engineers are always trying to get rid of. We took the Pythagorean scale as a simple method because it is a harmonic scale and it is a proportional scale. That's not moving. Not here. It's down there. Can you move that? So yeah, that's the proportional scale. So we just used that as a simple way of building a kind of proportional idea. There are the notes, that's the pitch, and then this is the frame itself. So the frame is set up by using different wavelengths. They determine the X, Y, and Z functions, and they build the frame themselves. I might go back on that actually, that's a bit fast, is it? Okay, so that's the first box. So that's the first room. You can see 3 wavelengths on the left hand side, and they determine the shape of the box. You can see the axle on that side. Then you have the next 3 notes. They determine the second box. You can see the plan on the bottom in blue, the elevation, and then the axle. You get a second round of frame, and then the third option are the last 3 notes. And they basically give you an overall room, or all series of rooms, that you get all of these wavelengths resonating. So what happens in a resonance is that the wave overlaps itself, and so it becomes louder and louder and louder and louder. And so you end up being very much in an environment of a particular note, or 3 notes, as you have a room which is 1, 2, 3. And this is an interesting idea that we were floating around for a while, so we tried to see if it would work. We didn't even know if it would or if it wouldn't. But it did. It needed a little bit of tuning, but it worked in the end. We composed something where you could tune the actual score through proportion, so we could tune it afterwards.
So you tune the proportion of the rooms and that? Yeah?
Yeah. Perfect. So this is just about building it, and then this is the frame. So it's quite big. The problem with sound is you can only really test it at 1:1. That's why you don't get very many sound models, because it ends up being very, very large. So we basically chose a series of notes that weren't too big, because otherwise you'd be building 7 or 8 meters. And so it's really just a very simple idea. You fill out the rooms with different types of materials based on their absorption and reflection. So you try and really generate as much sound as possible, so you're not getting any absorption into the materials. And you can see here, kind of looking at those absorption coefficients. Then you panel out the room, and then you get the room itself. So what we did is we placed speakers in the ceiling, so that would pulse the notes that are specific to each room into the room, and then you can play. It's like an instrument. You can walk between rooms and you can put different notes into the different rooms and test to see how it works. And then again, there's always the idea of the moment. So we might just play a couple of those compositions if it's possible very quickly. So these are the compositions which done. So these are the notes that would go into each room. They're sine waves basically. And you see the clouds can show the space is modelled. So you can see the bands of black show the resonance. So the clouds as they move out show the room, the resonant room. And you get each note played into each volume, so you can figure out what it is. And then we did a series of little studies on it. The next one is, so white noise is basically noise which has all of the notes in the world in the wavelength, and we basically played them into the room to see if the room would resonate, if the notes of the room would resonate out of the white noise if we pulsed it in, recorded it, put it in again, a kind of Alvin Lucier method of determining if the room would resonate. And you can hear the sound of the notes coming out of it after a period of time. That whoa, wow, wow.
The darker bands there, you can see them establishing. Just see how it starts to develop darker bands. They're the prominent notes in the room.
Okay.
resonating then eventually out of the white noise.
And then you get a series of kind of chords being built up. So you can stand between each 3 rooms and you can play the thing like an instrument, making it bigger. And you see all the resonances kind of waving, banding down. And there's a lot of different studies. We don't think play them. We might go back to the other thing there.
What was amazing about that room was that when the music was playing, the entire air felt solid. It felt like it was all moving. It's extraordinary space to stand in, you know, really, really powerful. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay, we're going to finish up, I think, and go on to the lads. So this is a project in Wicklow. Again, we're looking at an idea of landscape and just contradiction, really. Ireland is a very interesting place. We've had a long history, and through that history, lots of different opinions have kind of developed and overlapped. So you kind of get an idea of a lot of rural people who build farmhouses and cottages end up assuming different classical ideas and vice versa, because classical architecture is very much an architecture of the British in Ireland. So you get this kind of different mix between kind of Neopalladian ideas and the vernacular. So we kind of looked at this in this project a little bit, and we've developed a site plan of that kind of 2 wings, central bay, and also kind of vernacular rural, and you end up getting this kind of slightly Palladian style house, which is cross between that and a farmhouse. And we looked at kind of an idea of sash window, which is this beautiful type of window. And this is interesting because a very, very small detail can actually turn your whole understanding of how a house works. And through this kind of series of studies in sash windows, we ended up looking at making a house out of all these things that open out onto the forest. So it very much determines the plan. You get sash windows either side, you get a kitchen garden on one side and you get a wood on the other. And then you get an upstairs, you get elevations, and then you end up looking at this in terms of how the spaces work. And then that in turn determines how the structure works. So you have this outer skin and you have this kind of softer internal world. And you can see then how ideas of colonnade and beam and post begin to work. And that's very
Hey, by the way, it's very hot in here, so if anyone wants to go get a beer, we don't care. Don't worry. You know. Hi, I'm Andrew. This is Colm. But basically, we have similar concerns to Steve and Daire, but we mainly drive our practice through the art of how you make something, how you build something, what it's made out of. This is the very first commission we got, which was this church sits in the centre of Dublin, and was constructed in the early 20th century, and they needed a lot of additional accommodation. It's a very small budget, but they needed a lot of extra room because the church was extremely vibrant, had about 80 different nationalities, so lots of different faiths, and no money. And the challenge was put to us then to try and come at how we would design something inside this building, and we were very reluctant to do it at first because the room was so beautiful. And so the strategy that we arrived at was, to connect the intervention with the door of the church so that you pass through it and see the altar before you see our addition. So that our addition is just a threshold and not an object. It's just experience. And then the form of the object was built to frame items within the church itself. So it's just an elaborated threshold. And then in section as well, picking out the apse at the end of the church. And so in many ways, the job was very much a study in the inevitable, really. And so this is the door, and the form itself just builds itself around the door into the church. And you enter through it. And we made it in walnut to match the brickwork of the church itself. And what was very interesting about this was that we couldn't find a builder in Ireland to make this, because the building industry is not as sophisticated as it is here. And we ended up using a boat builder, and he added a lot to how this was built. And that was quite interesting for us to explore how somebody who makes actually informs the design. and that adds to a richer whole. And we brought that with us to the
Well, it was the first time as well, because I really enjoy working with Andrew, because I'm quite quiet and Andrew's quite loud. And when I met Andrew in another practice, we just had a lot of conversations, and actually design, it was a revelation to me, because I was a little hermit who wanted to like squirrel away and not talk to anybody. And design was a conversation, and has become so in our studio and in our practice, and it's very important. And I suppose that conversation, this job was the first job, and we realised that extended to the builder, because in Ireland maybe builders aren't as precise, or the job isn't as systematic as it is in Switzerland. It's always quite open and quite nebulous and cloudy and ambiguous. So when we get to site, there's another conversation which happens with the builder, and in this case it really enriched the project. So the way the whole thing was made and jointed at the corners was all a conversation that happened subsequent to our design. And in a way it was a lesson to us in terms of building practice, or how to make things. That it was about that we do all this drawing work, and we draw and we make models and we have these conversations, but then the builder, he gets on site and he draws the building again, and we have this other conversation again. And so we learned that actually we could make things in that way.
Yeah. This is a very interesting job, because it started with a man asking us to put a roof light in his kitchen. And it kind of, we did give him the roof light. We gave him the roof light. This is the story of all our jobs here. And it kind of grew. He had just bought this house on this amazing site in Kerry, which is down in the southwest of Ireland. It's a very special place with a microclimate, so it's slightly warmer, slightly more tropical than the rest of the country. And the house sits in the middle of this site on a hill. And the whole thing was made in the 18th century by a German botanist who lived in Ireland. And yeah, this is the lake here.
That's that big lake you saw. Sorry, these drawings are really washed out, and you're going to have to sort of bear with us. And then this is the site, so the lake is here.
Yeah.
And this botanist, he made this romantic garden that was his own world, and like he made this huge big hill in the middle, so that he could plant all these trees and then still look across and out to the lake.
It's interesting, the house had a long history. It had been turned into a hotel and other things. And so our very first thing when we arrived on site is the client started talking about the house, and he did not like any of it. So it became more than a roof light, and maybe we might change this, and maybe we might move this. And by the end we had brought the house back to what it was when it was first built, in this first conversation with him. And then he went, okay, so you've taken it all away, now you have to give it back. You've got to do it again, do it better. And what's really interesting about these house types is that they're very common in Ireland. They're called the house of the middle size. And they were built from patterns from people like Abraham Swan and people like this. And what's really interesting about them is they're highly ordered figures in the landscape, extremely defined, but asymmetrical, and propose a very rich range of spaces just by the simple moving of the staircase. And so each room is unique. And
so they're really abstract, but once you get inside, just through simple disposition of service core, most of the time in a 2-bay plan, they make this really rich space, enfilade space, which is really cool.
And what's also very hard about them is they're complete. You can't add to this. This is perfect. So how do you add to something that is complete? And so what we decided to do is to use a different spatial type. And we just proposed a field of columns around the house, and then made clearings in those columns for rooms, and then a line and a series of objects which make kitchens and fireplaces and things like this, and then a weathering line which makes a series of indoor and outdoor spaces. So you get patios and courtyards and a staircase and a garden on the roof.
Patio, kitchen, dinings, back of house, rest of house.
Now at this time, we were not working in the rest of the house, we were only doing the extension. The wife was in control of the rest of the house, and she had her interior designer, so we were just looking here and working here. We weren't thinking about the rest of the house.
We weren't allowed in here.
We weren't allowed into this building. There was an interior designer, and she was fabulous. And we weren't allowed to go there. So we saw our job to make a threshold between the garden and the house. That's it, just a threshold, nothing more. That's just a section showing there's a basement, there's chimneys that hang and things like this. So the landscape of the floors are always moving up and down against the columns, which are regular and ordered. And then this is the other exciting thing about it. Again, for us, we always show images of the building on site because this is so exciting for us. When you arrive and the first thing you see is something you designed and it's there. Sometimes it's terrible. Sometimes it's quite nice. This was a very special day because the chimney was in and the room starts to feel good.
You understood it. It's the second thing I've ever made, so it's like for us we're still very naive, and so we're very excited for these.
Yeah, we're like children at these moments. And then this is when it's finished, so you get this quite abstract frieze to the landscape, but then from the inside it's all just about framing the garden and the furniture. They have an amazing furniture collection. And so it's just a curtain, a polished concrete floor and some nice furniture, and it works. And then the paneling was all a study in marquetry, so we used silver bird's eye maple, which matches the type of concrete that we were using, and so the kitchen just disappears.
But this was quite interesting because you can't really see it because, again, maybe our fault, but the image is a bit too dark. But the contractor made a mistake, and he priced this whole house to build. Basically, we wanted really fine concrete, and he priced for the cheapest concrete, which was for making a basement car park. And in Ireland, they're really rough, like really nasty. And anyway, he was brilliant, and we had this great conversation with him, and so he ended up making beautiful concrete, but there was water marking on it, like marbling across the surface. And so, I don't know if we have an image yet.
We do later, closer on.
So you can see, we then came on site and went, oh, this is awful, what are we going to do? You know, it's terrible. And then we stood there for about 5 minutes and went, actually, it's really, really, really nice. It's really lovely. We mentioned it to her, and she said, oh, you should check out this silver bird's eye maple, which is just she was saying, it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And actually, the two of them just, if we talk about resonance, the two of them just resonate off each other, and it's really, really good, actually.
There's an amazing story about that because we couldn't find someone in Ireland to make the joinery, and we were buying the furniture for the house in New York with our client, and the client we were in this amazing room with antique furniture, and he goes, I smell a good joiner, I smell a good joiner. There must be one near. And he went and he found one. And this guy had all this silver bird's eye maple. He was an architect who had been taught by the same person who taught us. He was taught in Harvard, and an Irish professor was over there. And then this professor came to Ireland, and suddenly we had this amazing conversation, and Jonah goes, okay, I'm moving the workshop to Ireland, we're going to make you your kitchen. And he came over with 5 men, and he returned with only 2. He lost 3 of them in Kerry. So this is the house. It's very simple. You don't really see it. It's just it just makes the threshold to the garden. But something interesting happened as this was finishing, because nothing was happening in the old house, and we were going, "What's up?" You know, I heard it was amazing. And it turns out they just fired the interior designer. So all of a sudden, the roof light became the extension, became the whole job. And suddenly we had to design the interiors to the original house. And we learned from the paneling in the extension. And we always liked panelled rooms, and we liked the idea of lining. So we took the proportions of the extension and we borrowed them. We brought them back into the old house. And we made all the rooms in timber. Just an echo, suiting the old house, but an echo of what we were doing in the extension. These are a bit dark.
These are really dark.
It's nicer in reality. You have to trust us.
It's a really good place to get drunk.
This is fantastic for whiskey here. Yeah. And then if it's a bathroom, it's mirrors and stuff. So it's simple. Yeah. But then the client decided that the lake was a little bit too cold, and he liked swimming a lot. So he asked us, would we consider making a swimming pool? So we thought about it and we said, yeah. We didn't. So the house is here, the extension is here, and the pool now is going to be here. So it's going to be retaining wall to the hill, and another threshold between the house and its grounds.
So just to explain, the house, you can't see it because the drawings are so washed out. The existing house is here, so it sits on this hill, which is sort of here. And so our our sort of extension began to become almost infrastructure in a way to the garden. So it became big retaining wall, which runs along here, and then the drop makes the swimming pool, which is, this is the kitchen that you saw with the cellar in the basement, and then the swimming pool is here, which you can see in section very clearly. So this is the extension, existing house, and then swimming pool with the pool hall here as a volume, as a very vertical volume. So the horizontal volume of the extension.
Yeah. So these are just the plans. We put a lot of effort into the proportions. So we used the other proportions, but we just tweaked them a little bit. And this one's invisible. Yeah. Ray did a lot of models on this one, actually. So we worked a lot with. This is I think the next one's one of Ray's. So we work a lot with big models to try and understand the space exactly before we can make it. And so the building is actually a study of where it's making a room to the outside. You have two columns.
Sorry, I'll go back.
Yeah,
there.
Two columns when it's inside, and then when you don't need it. So one line of columns for the roof and for everything that's cold, and another line inside for everything that's warm. And so there's two completely separate buildings just inside one another.
So it becomes a colonnade, which is about the exterior, which actually on top of that wall is surrounded, and then set inside of that is another colonnade, which is the interior. And that space inside, you want me to go back?
No, keep going. And what's quite nice then is because the columns here are thicker, you don't see the veranda. It removes the veranda from the pool. So these kind of unexpected things, by looking at how things are made, we think are very important. And again, on this one, learning about how you might go about building. But it's also a lesson about how you talk to your client, who's another designer, I think. Somebody who puts ideas in your head and who talks things through and isn't always wrong. Sometimes, most times wrong. But the plan of the original house and thinking about that space had gone into our head, and the typology of the square plan became something that we explored in a number of projects. I mean, this is Schinkel, obviously, and Van Eyck on the right. So it's a game that architects have always played with, and this is a house in a field in Wicklow near Dublin, and we were just playing with the 9 square plan and asymmetric space, working off that. So very simple.
Sorry, keep clicking.
No. Break for beer. So these are just models exploring that one. This one is not very healthy. We don't know if it's going to be built, so we don't know. We hope. So this is another one for an amazing old woman in the suburbs of Dublin who lived here, but the house was not suitable, and she wanted a house just for her, and she had a garden next door. So we just made a very We just made a very simple plan of a ground floor plan that's just all one space, but the space is made then by 2 voids on the diagonal overhead with just 2 bedrooms.
Sorry, there's an idea in that plan as well. It's sort of to do with we became obsessed for a while, and I think we're growing out of it, thankfully, about these square plans and the simplicity or the abstraction of the exterior, which is this thing in the Irish landscape, and then the complexity of the interior. And this one became interesting because she was very old, and she wanted a modern house, which for her was open plan, which for us is always a bit of an issue in an Irish climate. So we made these 2 volumes that had a threshold across them by these 2 double-height spaces. But then also, at that time, you couldn't design anything without somebody asking you about something called a resale value, which was like, oh, when I sell my house, it's got to be a 3-bed, it's got to have en-suite, it's got to have this, that, and the other. And instead of just saying I want to have a home, so these voids were a way to satisfy them that they could make it a 3 or a 4-bedroom house when they needed to sell it. When they had to move out. Anyway, these are elevations of that. It's very dark.
Yeah. But this interest in typology is something that we're cataloguing at the moment. We're making an atlas of all the terraced house types in Ireland. So we're using our students to survey them, but they like it. It's good. They learn how to draw.
They survey our houses.
Yeah. So, and this is going to be a book. The first 100 is coming out later this year, and we're very interested in documenting the types of living spaces which exist in your country and which make your cities. The terraced house is very interesting because it builds the cities in Ireland. But to return to the square plan, we were asked to make some spaces for artists in a park in Dublin. And this park used to be a farm, and the farm was here and these were all the fields, but the city came out and it became a park. But this is all private for the people who clean the park, and it divides up the whole park. And so they asked us to make a place for some artists to work, and we said that they should make this existing house into a place for the artists to live.
Well, you should explain first. It was quite funny because Andrew got this phone call about the job on that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And somehow he completely got it wrong. And we arrived at the meeting with this new building, and they were like, oh, because we just wanted like 4 small rooms in different parts around the city, and you've given us one big building. And then they sort of looked at it for a while and said, that's a really good idea. We should do this. Because we have so little money for each one that if we put them together, we can make one big one. So it was a fortuitous mishap.
It's good to be complete in this. We're very interested in buildings that define their own limits, that close themselves and contain themselves. And so they had 4 rooms, one for a dancer, one for a musician, one for a painter or a sculptor, and one for a media artist. And they had different sizes.
Dancer, musician, painter, artist.
Yeah, media kind of guy. Yeah. And then the north is here. So we were able to make a plan of north lights that complete every room. So there's no odd corners, but you get this piece which is made of several rooms, each of which is complete. And then you get this quite interesting spatial quality where every room is unique in a very simple way. And again, some work by Ray. So this is a model to explain to them that idea about the spaces that were resulting in this.
I suppose just what's important in this one is that, as Andrew says, it's like it becomes so tight that as soon as you pull one piece apart, it falls apart. So there was a proportion that set up everything, and that was due to the pitch of the roof lights always having to complete the room, which to us was very important, that we didn't get these odd profiles that were sort of uncomfortable in the space. So you can,
the rooms all have their own grain. They're all complete rooms, but they're all their own space. Yeah. And then, this is quite funny, it was going to be built by prisoners.
This is even funnier, because we arrived on site, and they were working on the other buildings on the site, and they were really, really friendly to us. We were like, what's going on? It's like all these builders who want to sit down and talk to us and have tea.
Yeah.
And then we found out it's because they only get out of jail for about 3 hours a week, and they're just like, wow, people.
Yeah. So it's like, hey, I'm normal. No, you're not. But then we had this thing, you might have seen the barn at the start, which was built in the 19th century, 2 men building a little bit every day. So we just decided to make this in the same way. You do 1 a day, and you try and build the building over time. So it's very Irish type of concrete, not like the Swiss concrete. We're good at this stuff, the messy stuff. And then it just sits in the park, very simply. And again, then this is an art gallery in a small Irish country town. And this is a similar kind of a game, but on a bigger scale. So effectively it sits and addresses a public space in the back of the town. And it's made up of, it's just made up very simply of a ground plane which is modelled to make different private spaces, and then a table for these private spaces and courtyards above. And then the whole thing is linked by one staircase, which you can see to the top of as soon as you enter the building. So the idea is that the building is a public house. You can just walk up it feels like a house. There's a staircase like a house, and it's open, and it tells you where you want to go, much like a house does. And that's the whole architecture of the building, is this simple idea about a staircase. And that's how we work as well, so a little bit annoying. And then this is that staircase.
I suppose it's just where it's at. Like it's funny because that first job, or the one in Kerry, sort of set up so many jobs for us. Like this became a study in the big house in the town, as Andrew says, and in the Irish condition, that becomes even this facade, which becomes very modulated. It's about this strange sort of applique of classicism that exists in the Irish context that Stephen was referring to. And so the chance encounters, strangely enough, that have happened over the course of just 4 years have sort of led us to very specific architectural languages, I suppose.
This is something we like to try and find out about how people used to do things, because we think that sometimes architects are way too eager to throw things away. And this was a study we did in UCD with another architect into this technique of timber vaulting, which is a very efficient way of making double curved spans. And what we tried to do is to build a space in the grounds of UCD.
Very thin,
Yeah.
not brick slips, so they're really, really thin, and they're layered up, so they can support great weights.
And so it was just built over a long time, though, with lots of labour. But it was just to test the way of building, really. We were just interested in the way of building. But what's quite interesting about the technique is that we managed to get there, we managed to build it in the end. But also, the space itself we found quite intriguing, quite beautiful, and a type of space that in our education we would never have thought of designing, because we were kind of brainwashed by a brigade of people who believed in orthogonal space and plasterboard. And so we think that architects' ability to think about space is limited by their ability to understand how to make it. And we think there's a direct conversation between how you make something. And so this idea of the dome space, the thin dome, is something we're carrying with us and that we're continuing to explore today.
Well, there's something else in that too, which is that I think we're very limited, architects generally are limited by the industry of construction, because we got all of the bricks for free because the brick supplier said, oh, this is a good idea, it's a really cheap way to make domes and arches, and lots of architects want to do that, but they can't because the budget's too expensive. And suddenly now they're very interested in this as a way of, as a product again, which is really cool because it allows us then to explore, we're looking at a space for a community building basically, which is...
Well, we're doing some works to a church. And what they're interested in is it's a Catholic church in a very Muslim area, and they're interested in having a room that they can meet all the different religions in, and secular people, that is shared between all of them. And so we're thinking of the dome. This is actually a competition entry we did with Ryan Kenahan, who's another friend of ours in Dublin, for a similar type of space in Stockholm. And again, just using the dome and working with it to try and understand its possibilities. But we're bringing this to this church in Dublin. And we're going to be making a series of spaces like this now. And the first piece we're making is this. It's a new altar for the church. So we're going to start with this piece, and then we're going to finish the job over the next 7 years. So it's just begun, and we'll see now where it goes. But this idea of looking at the past and learning from the past is something which kind of is the story of the last project we're going to talk about. We've just got a big, I suppose, research grant to study old Irish forms of construction, which is not really well understood by architects in Ireland. Architects in Ireland tend not to look at archaeology as a source. They tend to just see it as an interesting diversion. But when we see these spaces and the buildings that they built in prehistory, we're kind of intrigued by them, and we think that there's validity there. And so what we're going to be doing is using one of these techniques and developing it in a building laboratory to make contemporary space efficiently today. So we don't know where that's going to go, it's just started. It comes out of the dome work actually, it started in the dome and then it's going to go here, so we'll see where it goes. But it has a direct relationship with this project, which is it's a very funny project because actually, although the church was the first project we built, this is the project that started the firm. So we were working in this firm and we were doing all this shit work and at least we thought it was shit, he thought it was genius, but it wasn't. I got asked by my uncle to help him find a site for his children to build a house in. He'd been through a lot of other architects and they couldn't get him a site. And so Colm and I went up to his land, it's just here, a big field full of trees in this beautiful valley with a lake in the middle of it. And in the middle, the site is like this. It's completely dark, so it's perfect to live in. And in the middle of this crowd of trees, we found this quarry, which was the quarry that they had used to build the dam that makes the lake, and which is this dam here. So all of this came out of here, and so we thought it might be good to put some people back in there. And so this is the space that we started with, and then the project becomes an exercise in poche, because although this looks like an extremely rural site, actually the constraints that affect that site are very similar to the constraints which say affect the Hotel de Beauvais. There is an extremely rigid geometry. If we just maybe look at the site plan of what you can and cannot do. So this is the forest trees, there's one quarry here, there's another one here, this is south, so light only gets to here, and then we weren't allowed to build beyond there because we might pollute the water in the lake, which was for drinking. So we had to stay about 400 metres away from the lake. So it left us with a very tiny space to put a house in. And so what we did with the house was we just made a ground floor about getting up, a shared staircase and service rooms for the two houses. And then on top of this, a landscape of living, which is living rooms facing south to the quarry, and then bedrooms and more intimate living spaces facing towards the trees.
Well, it's worth saying that the brief was for two houses. So it was a family, so a brother and a sister. So this is the sister's house, and this is the brother's house. And we wanted to keep the form as, well, this is the planning restriction line here, and this is the line that's the shade of the quarry wall. So we wanted to make a building between those two lines that then made a grand living room with the landscape. So the quarry became a big living room to these two houses. And then we just filled in the gap in the same way that the Hotel Particulier in Paris does the same thing.
And so this is the section, how you get in. There's a, sorry, you have to show that on the mouse.
Yeah.
So there's a shared staircase for both houses that brings you up, and then it divides, and then from
this staircase.
Yeah. And then at the back there's a veranda, and that veranda links back up to the roof garden. Yeah.
And then you can come off the quarry up when the sun goes down and catch a bit higher up here, and then again higher up again up here.
So this is the plan of the sister's house, you know, big living room, kitchen, you know. What was quite interesting is we were, you know a house, but what was quite interesting is that we were building it all in massive timber construction, and so the length of it all comes from Austria. So the length of the house is twice the length of the container that it came in. And so we had to have these very orthogonal forms, and then just the poche, the triangle in the middle, which we had to fill. And it was quite an interesting exercise in construction efficiency and in spatial planning.
You can't really see that.
This actually is a very nice drawing, but it's gone. And this is an early version of the house. It's a little bit different, but it's very nearly finished now, so we have some photos of it. This is the view from the house itself looking towards Dublin. And this is quite interesting because this is an old Irish way of building a ceremonial air burial room. But it's made of massive timber posts and very light infill. And the massive construction shelters the lighter so they can last for a very long time. And it's also a technique which exists in Scandinavia. Here you have barn types. Again, massive timber construction making the infill last a lot longer, because it's very humid in Ireland, very wet, so timber construction is not so easy. And out of this we built this whole language of construction. And so this is it starting. You can just see down to the lower quarry, and then the staircase in the middle going in. And so this is the staircase, yeah. And then the timber starts to arrive and starts to come up. And so the way it works is that, there's two beams, one that's 1.6 meters high and one that's 600 mil high. And the fins on the outside, every second one is structural to stop those from bending. And so we doubled them and made a language for the house. Yeah. They're kind of shifted.
Sorry, you can't see these. Apologies.
This is the house as you come up to it. And then the garden is in the quarry, which is shared between the two houses. And then inside it's just a very simple game of a series of classically proportioned spaces. This is the entrance hall, which is lined, and then the main living room, the quarry to the left. And that's effectively all we have on that project. It's going to be finished very shortly. And so that's us. So thanks very much for listening to us.